contrived connection, but I think about that, probably very true assertion that humans look at technology as this locally useful thing for producing, and then they port their own value into how can they work alongside technology to make things more useful or more productive, which is a very narrow scope of what it is to be human. Humans can write poetry, be self-referential, we create culture, but there's something about technology that compresses humans into this economically productive unit.
So Heidegger was really worked up the first time he heard someone use the word human resources. Right, and he says because eventually what's going to happen is we're going to see ourselves in technological terms of accessibility and use, and he's not just worried that Soylent Green is people, literally, but I think he is for.
Everybody, listen to me, Hatcher. You gotta tell him Soylent Green is people.
But he's worried that then we'll only have a means and attitude to ourselves, to everything, and what his worry is this will lead us to what he calls a certain kind of oblivion to being, right? Is an oblivion, a forgetfulness again, right? Full circle to Plato here, a forgetfulness of what being really is. And we'll only see it as what it is to us, how we can access it.
Well, the Soylent Green analogy is funny, that's an extreme, right? Where it's the Charlton Heston movie that,
it's a great metaphor though.
It's a great metaphor, and a la the Plato where you never know if it's a metaphor or it's real. I think he talks about 5 stages of technological development in that essay, and one of them is sacrifice. And you think about a lot of pagan scapegoating cycles and past efforts at garnering sacred knowledge or technology, and they involve kind of brutal practices. And I think you could go all the way back to ancient practices to the Nazis trying to sort of do this at scale for forbidden knowledge and technology. And it's funny because
I think G.K. Chesterton actually draws, I think, a connection between, sort of pre-scientific magic and technology. And human sacrifice and technology. The idea is that if we just had the right technique, we could force the world's hand to do what we want.
Right. Yeah,
and certainly I think Girard would see something like that too.
Oh, for sure. And there's a way in which tech used to be an augmentation of human. It was an extra appendage or something. And then, I think post-information revolution, it's sort of become this parasitization of humans.
So Heidegger's one of Heidegger's great examples is he compares a hydroelectric dam to a medieval windmill, or a medieval water mill, Because on those, say in the medieval versions, and I'm not saying we peaked in the 12th century or something like that. I'm glad my wife can build it, right? Okay.
Yeah.
But with the medieval windmill, it works when the wind blows. Okay, so you're going to build something that makes you have to work along with nature. Okay. Yeah. All right. Whereas the hydroelectric dam, for all its virtues, though, it's saying, nature, I will take from you what I want and store it. So it's all on our terms, right? And it's about how we access you, right? And not how can we work with you.
It's mastery over nature in a way. It's not just harmonizing with nature. And those two things are very distinct. I mean, there are two competing theories of the inevitability of human evolution or of existence on Earth, and there's the Gaia James Lovelock theory that the Earth is somehow super resilient, and so we might come and go, but the Earth will always sort of come back. And then there's the Medea theory, which is we inevitably will blow ourselves up, and that maybe there's some evidence that happened on Mars or something. And they're sort of competing. There's and definitely modern tech seems to be in the category of just being able, how do we control everything? If you think about VR is that to the limit, where it's the entire world that we might be living in is controllable. And so I don't know, taking it one step farther with the Plato thing, do you ever think like this is like we're in these like biological skin suits that are basically like VR headsets, and the contemplation of virtue or some other criteria that we don't fully understand are the means through which we ascend through these things into the light and become even worthy of that next step outside of the cave. Because I also thought, the Heidegger thing might connect, where it's like we're porting ourselves through these like low-level economic production engines via technology. I believe that also kind of dovetails with a test that Plato puts the Guardians through, like at the age of 30 or whatever. If you fail, like you don't get to study metaphysics. You just like become the economic producer or whatever.
Yeah. So I think at this point is where like a Heidegger and Plato come apart. Okay, or at least this is where Heidegger becomes a critic of Plato's. Okay, because he would look at something like that dialectical process in the Republic, whereby one like ascends to a kind of enlightenment, as a quasi-technological attitude. Okay, and whereas for Heidegger, for him, the metaphor is more like architectural. Like you build a temple and you hope someone shows up there. Right? Okay, and a lot of his later work goes to this, where he talks about how we need artwork, okay, but meaning we need art that does the work of art. And what is the work of art? Is it provides a place, sort of like a theater where an actor could show up for us. Okay, so for Heidegger, it's like we're more passive in the process, okay, than say for Plato, where we'd be more active in the process. Like there would be an educational process that one could go through, right, that would get you there, right? Whereas for Heidegger, it's like, well, if divinity is going to show up for us, right, if the transcendence is going to show up for us, then it cannot be our doing. Like, and he thinks what's happened in the modern world is because we only think of like what we can take and do and grab and process, right? We need to regain an ability just to build something that is sort of receptive rather than aggressively extracting. Do you see that? And I think for me, I probably lean more towards Heidegger on that. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, speaking of that, is the UFO a technology that sort of, if there's a push and a pull outside of the cave or whatever, is the UFO some sort of pulling technology? Because you talk about this where it's this thing that it busts all of your priors.
Yeah.
It's like you have all these like prior categorization techniques. I
didn't want to talk about this. Right?
Today
I did, but like early, 5 years ago.
But you find yourself obsessed because it's inherently kind of uncategorizable.
Yeah, that's kind of where I land with the UFO. Is it seems like something's knocking. Right, there's some, and maybe it's always been knocking at the door, right? Because we have different metaphors for it throughout history, but it seems like something's knocking, right? And whether we listen to it through a Platonic, process of dialectical improvement, or we listen to it through a sort of Heideggerian building a place where it could dwell, right? That it seems that something is trying to remind the human of something, right? That's just trying to jog our memories. Like I like to use Plato's metaphor. And I'm not really, like, I don't trust any of our metaphors about it. Is it an angel? Is it a demon? Is it, is it an elf or a fairy? It seems that all of that gives our imagination too much of a pass, right? But it does seem there is some pressure on us from outside our Umwelt, right? That we would do well to at least strategize how we would listen to. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. And so like, how does any of this comport with like the way we discuss this stuff in a government context? Because, we have like, we're talking at an extremely high abstract level of the kind of ontological truth. And then there's like, there are government whistleblowers coming out of, saying that they've retrieved UFOs, one of whom I've had on my show. And like, it's kind of hard to poke holes in his story. Like, felt like, pretty prima facie, at least, very, very, like an honest account. And so how do we square that circle?
I don't know that I can. And because for me, and this is not, I am not like calling anyone into question or anything like that, but like I have no special access to anything. I'm just an average dude, right? Okay, right. And so I have to always ask myself, like, what's more likely? Like, what this person's telling me is true, and they could be speaking a falsehood and not be lying. I'm not saying anyone's lying or anything like that. But like, you always have to weigh, is like, is this testimony true, right, against the probability that this person's been somehow deceived, or et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And just taking, like, whether, you know, it's any of the whistleblowers, I don't know how I can really weigh that out.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? So like, let's say, you know, we talked to whistleblower, you know, Roy, right? Okay.
Sure.
And, you know, we asked Roy, hey, you know, yeah, you've been told this, and this by all these people.
Yep.
And it seems unlikely that they're all in on something. That seems unlikely.
Yeah.
Okay? But then it seems really unlikely that these things they're telling you is true too.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Of course.
So this is an old argument from David Hume about miracles. And so we have to weigh that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like I can't even really make a meaningful comparison of those probabilities.
Well, I would say in the world in which like forbidden knowledge is a real thing.
Yes.
That there's some, you know, cleaving off of like black world science or knowledge. You know, the government would be attempting systematically to get that, you know, just from a game theory, geopolitical lens.
You have to assign some plausibility.
Yep.
To like maybe, well, the thing is as soon as we do that, and this gives me fits. So as soon as so I think no matter what now, you've got to have a pretty unlikely conspiracy theory, because either like this has been covered up for 75 years, right? You know what I mean? Or there's something really weird going on now where it seems like now people want us to believe it.
Right.
So either way, you've got like a prima facie low probability conspiracy theory you're going to have to take.
Yeah.
One or another, right?
And then I always ask myself the question, like, you know, because of course you have to go back and forth, but like, I'm like, why are like some of these people are like very high level in prosaically important government, military, and science roles. And I'm like, if we are in some like multipolar new Cold War, why are you systematically sending all of these top guys to like psyop the American population?
I know.
That seems crazy.
Yeah.
That seems crazier than, you know, as a null hypothesis than the inverse, which is just like, actually this has been going on for, you know, thousands of years.
See, there's where I think you and I come apart. I don't know which is crazier.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Well, I'm more in that, like, I'm wading through the waters of speaking to all these people.
But I think I do think you have to say now that it's been on the floor of the Congress and things like that. That's got to pump the probability up a little bit, right?
Yeah.
You know, but not. I don't know if all the way.
Yep.
Right. Because
it's funny. Like as I say things, people don't think. 2, 1. That's such a crazy thing for me to say.
I know.
But it's like you could just say like New York Times, Congress, Schumer Amendment. You know, you say these things. Somebody who holds credentials. I go, whatever you say next as far as what they believe, I now believe. And then you go into all these sort of first principles, like more interesting inquiries into like how reality works, a la what we're doing now. And it's like it's not even wrong, or like a false cloud, or like crazy, or whatever. You need to somehow their receptors around like, you know, credentialism need to be like that. 3, 2, let me listen. You know? It's like that's not the way we should be quiet. No.
Okay, so apparently, I'm probably not going to. Apparently, there are cases where the experiments told you this is a placebo. This is a neurosubstance.
Yep.
Giving it to you.
Still helps.
Yeah. The person giving it still has it right. And so if it's someone like you just going to it's kind of but like if someone dresses like a doctor,
totally. Well, and there's certain people who have a priority towards magic, and others who don't, and then that becomes their reality. Like it's like the Plato thing. Everything's going to tell you is lie. Then why would you say that? You get all confused, and then he goes on to tell us like stuff that like there's and then you know maybe there's some lies, but like you're extremely there are layers to it's like Leo Strauss, this you know 20th century philosopher. He was a big Platonist too,
but he also thought those books were full of lies.
Totally, but then you never know if he was writing in a coded fashion himself, and so it was like, and then like the people around him like had these like weird communication techniques, and so it's this never-ending thing, and you could say the exoteric is implying meaning that doesn't exist,
right?
And the esoteric is like the room, and is actually empty when you get to it, and it's like it's all some coordination mechanism.
Yeah.
Or you could say the exoteric is throwing people off the trail, and and the more you like talk about that from a meta sense, then you're going, and you've created this cult.
Yes.
And it's like
and so I actually do this in the book where I say, okay, using the example of the Tic Tac. Okay, so what's my evidence of the Tic Tac? Well, this seemingly very reliable Air Force pilot, and said, and Alex Dietrich and David Fravor, they said these things, right?
Raytheon FLIR system.
Yeah. Okay. And so I have like testimony from seemingly reliable people. Okay. And if you say, but like, how can you buy that? But yet, like, I only know Bin Laden was shot.
Yeah.
Because of testimony.
Media.
Yeah, it came through the media, from reliable, like, Pentagon officials. I only know. And now, of course, maybe some of that stuff we shouldn't be so quick to believe, too. You know what I mean? But it seems to me you've got to put it on the spectrum.
Of course. But it's like, but you say, like, we detected a cork or whatever through, like, some particle accelerator.
Like, take Eric Harris.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and Eric is taking other people's word for that because he's a theoretical guy and he's not doing the experiments. And so it's the consensus reality. If you really get down to it, can just be totally managed.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, I mean, that has been known since Plato.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So what do I do with, let's say, disclosing stuff like that?
Yeah.
I mean, because I'll admit, I now self-conscious.
That's cool. I like that. I'm starting to be like that too.
Yeah.
I had a friend tell me yesterday or 2 days ago, Chris Ramsey has a great channel called Area 52. He goes, I'm not really into disclosure. He's like, I'm into UFOs. And I was like, I like that. That's pretty awesome. Yeah, this whole like dramatic process of like these people and blah blah blah. And it's like, it's fascinating, and I find some of the people very heroic and courageous, and I've loved all the people who I've got to have access to on the show. But ultimately, it's like, does that get you closer to some primordial truth? Is there, there are plenty of things can be true, little to be true, or whatever, and there's an ulterior motive involved as well. And to me, it's a lens through which you can, go to the deeper stuff. And some of them are going through their own processes and journeys. You talk to Jake Barber, David Drush, or any of these people, like it's opened up their world. They're like, they're diving into like what they want to know about like reality as well. But some of the contemporary kind of drama is not always the best interest.
And right now, let's say you said we're off the air, Jim, and I'm going to show you.
Yeah.
Here's what they showed me.
Yeah.
I got the whole stuff.
Yeah.
I would have to say, okay, but then why would I do it?
3,
Yeah, totally.
2,
Why are you showing me?
Go.
Yeah, so it seems like, and this is like one of the frustrations, even if you found out, you haven't found out.
Right. Well, that's why, if I had to make a prediction, I think contact or like true, like more disclosure, disclosure will be inherently this sort of jagged process where maybe you'll have 20% of the population still holding out saying, it's just impossible. But, say there's something in the next few years, my strong bias would be that event does not come from some like power structure on down disseminated message from like government officials. It's like some weird surprise thing. And if it's not that, it won't hit people epistemically in the right way.
Yeah, because think of it,
because they'll be skeptical forever.
3, 2, 1,
evolution
go.
has been taught in public schools, generations, right? But how many Americans?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the Big Bang Theory. How many Americans?
Yeah, not everything.
So it's like you have to. And it doesn't necessarily mean either.
Yeah.
So like what would even look like in a way that actually has
have all these questions. The scientists probably working on this stuff don't know exactly what they're looking at. They have all these questions. So it becomes this never-ending quest. The philosophical question, what is this good? And meanwhile, what you could be doing is just working on your own perceptive filter apparatus. If you treat yourself like, lens, work on the lens.
So it becomes less not even it's more can I come up with a philosophical model that makes sense that we would expect so then the question is how do we digest that to our seconds in friendships
absolutely. Yeah, no, that unlimited ability to derive truth inherently. I think, I don't know if there's anything, but I think we are literally in Plato's cave. And not only all the stuff we talked about around like decibel ranges or electromagnetic wave spectrum, but look at like physics itself. There's the weak anthropic principle and there's the strong anthropic principle. And the strong anthropic principle is like, well, eventually like you'll have enough iterations that like the universe will foster life. And then the weak anthropic principle is like the limits of our perceptive capabilities like make physics comport with our perceptive capability, which is so obviously true. Like I think the idea that Planck's constant, if you were to change it slightly, like you wouldn't have a habitable Earth, doesn't point towards like, oh, you had like a million tries and this was like the right try. To me, it's like physics itself is comporting to our perceptive limitations. And again, that's like an unanswerable question. You can endlessly sort of debate that.
How are we ever going to tease out the human from the non-human? Well, once we admit there's a human contribution to any of our teasing out, we're always going to.
Yes, and then the second you admit that the observer observed distinction breaks down, which like Jung would say, but I don't know, a bunch of people would say, like you then have to like look inwards, and you don't have to look inwards. If you are this like in just this biochemical like meat suit happy accident, then it's like you feel sad, like take an SSRI, like you're confused about something, like just learn the trite information. There's very little aesthetic sense as to how to decode yourself. And I do think like this to the limit ends up in this sort of endless interiority kind of self-indulgence thing. But I think a lot of people miss that today, how to sort of grow your own abilities to perceive.
I think there's a difference between sort of really like kind of facile work on yourself as opposed to what would it be called the Right, and I think it's a really great distinction.
Do you think like the next epistemological or scientific paradigm involves bringing the observer into the observed, or there's something about working on us that coincides with what we perceive? I mean, this would go back to like alchemy itself, which a lot of the early scientists were.
In a lot of ways, although we need to talk about it's gone off the rails, like this has been one of the central philosophical paradigms since Kant. Once we try to tease out the numeral from the phenomenal, right? That for us, as opposed to that which things are in themselves, conflict you'll get nowhere except ethically, right? Things we can know things in themselves in terms of like moral matters, right? Like that's it. And so I think in much of Western philosophy since Kant has been dealing with that. Now it's gone off the rails in different ways, okay? But I think, and then you go into the sciences, the hard sciences, same thing. Like this idea that we're ever going to like tease out the observer.
Yeah.
Right? In a lot of ways, this already is the paradigm in a lot of like serious thought. It's just the word just never gets out.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. It's also interesting how science itself might be converging on more of a Platonic worldview, where you have in increasing popularity the work of like Rupert Sheldrake, these morphic fields, or Michael Levin, where there's this interaction between biological forms and their local information fields that dictate their morphology or function in the case of like inherited learning, that seem to transcend pure kind of genetic inheritance, and often comports with, who knows if this like theory of consciousness is correct with microtubules. Roger Penrose has this work distributed objective reduction thing, but that involves these like, pyramidal tubular structures in the brain. It all maybe we end up just back to like Hellenic times, like talking about these like sacred geometry and stuff.
The little overlap. Sheldrake has this really interesting paper. Is the Sun conscious?
I love that.
Which he answers affirmatively. And you see similar work. I'm forgetting his name now. The American analytic philosopher in the last few years published a paper arguing that the United States is probably conscious. And both Sheldrake and this other paper are making the point that, well, if we know that a certain kind of organization causes the emergence of consciousness in us, and I think whatever you think consciousness is, it's hard to deny that where these organizational structures show up, you can consciousness. Well, Sheldrake makes the point, well, it looks like we can see those kinds of organizations in other places. And he makes a case, maybe the sun, et cetera, right? And so then I think what you're doing is you're getting a universe suffused with consciousness, right? But in a way that isn't like irresponsibly spooky either.
Yeah.
Do you see? I think that's very important.
Yeah, well, it's like sort of fractals of consciousness on up, and there's a sort of cybernetic village or something, and then there's the individual nodes. And even, if you think of us as like individual nodes, that totally comports with Sheldrake's stuff around, if you grow an organic crystal structure, you can then grow that crystal structure much faster on an ongoing basis. Or like, look at athletic accomplishments, which are similar to isomorphic resonance.
One guy breaks the 4-minute mile.
Exactly, the Bannister effect. And if you think about how computers work in kind of node systems, download times are much faster than upload times. So the first time you do a thing, it's going to be really hard, and it's going to be, really painful. And then the second time anybody even related to you in your node network does it, because they're, querying it from some central monad repository of information, that download is going to be much faster.
I did not know that.
It's interesting, right? Like literally, like the way, and then you get into all sorts of interesting stuff around, what is DNA? It looks like binary code.
And what you're moving to there is then fundamentally.
Yes. Yeah. But in a way that comports with literal observable science. I'm buddies with this guy Jim Keller, who's this legendary chip maker. Like the iPhones the chips in many of our iPhones, like literally are based off of his architecture. He worked at Tesla, and he's like, it is remarkable how much the human looks like a semiconductor in many ways. And he goes through all these specifics around that, and like how we're like conductive, and then he goes through the DNA, and like it's like binary, it's like transistors, and then this you have this burgeoning field of quantum biology, and so you have to wonder, are we getting information from like non-local, like William James would say, like there's some sort of transmission going on, and if you're put a person in a Faraday cage, the fact that they can think points against that theory, because if you're getting it from a traditional RF signal, the Faraday cage would kill the RF signal. But if you get into this like weird, spooky new science called, extended electrodynamics, where you have this sort of scalar, field, wave types or whatever, which a lot of people seemingly, high up in government seem to get behind, then maybe the sun is a scalar wave generator, and then maybe we're getting information from the sun and getting information from all sorts of places. Maybe the Aristotelian model of the sun, being the source of like knowledge is just true or something.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of that stuff too, without getting hung up on like the risks of science. Because I think as soon as you say that, like, are we geocentrist now? No, that's not the point, right? The point though is the world a set of interlocking conscious hierarchies? Right? I think that's the question. Yeah.
And that Aristotle seems to be. I mean, you write about it that the existence of non-human intelligence or aliens totally comports with an Aristotelian worldview.
I mean, they're not, for Aristotle, literally the planets are intelligences. Right? So they're not flying ships or something like that. But the idea that things are in a way affected or managed by non-human intelligence for Aristotle is apparent.
Do you think that, AI is like all the rage right now, that maybe our world is being sort of managed by an AI system that knows how to, the Jacques Vallée control system thing? It knows how to nip at the herd. So like if you, is about to go off, it shows up. A human node like reaches a certain state of consciousness, it shows up. And it's like this sort of like Earth sustenance kit. And we're not seeing the aliens. We're seeing like the envoys that the von Neumann replicators that they sent out to like manage us.
So there's a film that I saw in high school, right? That like it's been with me since then, right? And it's based on a novel, Failsafe. Okay, and I think it was originally made in like 1963, 64. Okay, so it's a Cold War film about a nuclear war that gets started by accident. Okay, and throughout the film, like really what we're being shown is how humans have become utterly irrelevant to the process. Okay, like it's and like there's early in the film, there's like people are regretting that we have to use humans. Okay, all right, so the human is becoming irrelevant, and it's very clear in the film, and this is before, in the popular imagination, artificial intelligence is a thing. Like, that's not a proposal in the film at all. But already, just based on regular mechanical operations, the film is proposing that we are being run. We are being run by things that we put into play. Okay, and the kind of rationality this is lending us to is like, it's sort of like, I think in a lot of ways AI is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the more we think in terms of certain kinds of mechanical intelligence, right, the more we make ourselves easier to mimic by machines. Did you see that?
Yeah.
And so already in the 1950s and 60s, people were worried that we're putting technological balls into play that will come back to us as if gods. Right. There's some I refer to in the book as a very underappreciated 20th century philosopher, Gunther Anders. This is definitely something he's worried about. That we're like he thinks we're creating Prometheus.
Yes.
We're letting Prometheus loose.
Yes.
And then in these technologies, and then those things will come back and run us.
Yeah, it's like creating a golem or summoning a demon or something, and then you sort of obsolete yourself in the process.
And you can, and already in the 50s and 60s, before there was any hint of AI in the popular imagination, this notion of human obsolescence was already in play.
Totally.
That we are going to make ourselves irrelevant to the world that we're making.
The best you can do at that point is let the program run and probably try to think about what makes you unique from the machine.
Yeah, exactly.
And then try to ascend out of, whatever paradigm you're existing in. But I do, this is obsession with AI, VR, whatever. It's like, if we're in a cave, why would you port yourself into like a lower level, more bit compressed cave?
We're like demoting ourselves.
You're demoting yourself. And like we're willfully doing that when like this whole thing could be a test.
Yeah.
And so I always found that so fascinating with this sort of obsession with like, we need to build like higher fidelity worlds. Like if you watch Ready Player One, that's not like a good world. Like the guy's living in a shanty town, and then like the AI VR thing is like an escape.
Yeah. So a lot of times people ask me, am I worried about AI, et cetera, et cetera? And my reply is, I think the game was done 80 years ago.
Right.
I think like I would even look at things like the Manhattan Project, where you had this thing, this like technological hyper object like took off, and like nobody really knew what was going on.
Yeah.
Think of like, if you watch the film Oppenheimer, like you get 3 different answers from Oppenheimer why he wants to do this.
Yeah.
So like it's who's running this now?
Yeah.
The technology is running this. Prometheus is running it.
Completely. Yeah. it's such a fascinating time where it was like clearly this big inflection point. He had such interesting philosophical kind of objections around what he was doing. He was sort of reluctantly doing it, but he he needed to do it on some level.
It's just gonna happen.
It was just gonna happen or something. And then he kind of decamped from that, and it was like Teller was more in that sort of it's gonna happen, so we might as well sort of build it ourselves. And it is this very Promethean, Faustian sort of story, and it's ultimately kind of tragic. And then it also, you have to wonder at that time, because that's when all the UFOs pop up.
Exactly.
In our visible reality, at least according to all the lore, and there's a lot of lore.
Or under this new interpretation, like appearing as technology, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's also like maybe, to the extent the Guardians want to keep the test going or something.
Yeah.
If we build like a firecracker in the cave, or we build a bomb in the cave, they're trying to like diffuse like some of these things, like keep the test going or whatever. And it's like does something super unprecedented happen when we discover the myth makers, when we develop the perceptive apparatuses through high energy output or through some sort of ascended consciousness to like see who's like messing with us. And does that just unravel reality?
And think of like the cosmic meaning of like humanity discovering that we could take ourselves out. You know what I mean? Like, it has to change us in ways that none of us have probably really dealt with.
Yes.
In our unconscious, right?
Yes.
That we now know collective suicide is a possibility for humanity.
Yes.
Which was not an option until the 1940s.
Yeah.
And so what like how is that a firecracker going off in the
Yes.
Like how is that going to change our ability to see what's there or miss what's there, et cetera, et cetera? Like it has to have an effect. This is part of Jung's point. Yeah.
Totally. And so what role does religion play in all of this? Because I love you talk about this, like Janus, the two-sided face or whatever. That religion plays a dual role of sort of sending you down the wrong path at times, but also pointing to the sacred.
Yeah.
And so, well, how do you view religion?
There's this really interesting passage from Aristotle that I use in the book where he's just gotten to the end of his natural theology. So he's just given his argument for an unmoved mover, and along with that comes this whole kind of romantic cosmology, of his. I don't mean that in a dismissive way, but like where everything's revolving, trying to get to the unmoved mover and all this. Okay, and then he says this shows that our ancestors, our most ancient ancestors, were not wrong when they posited that there was a divinity surrounding nature and things happen according to the means of divinity or something like that. But then he says, however, that got co-opted into stories that were told for legal purposes. Okay, so he kind of gives you a Nietzschean genealogy right there of the going Greek religion, right? And then he ends the passage by saying, but we can be interested in these more primordial tales because they now fit with what we're discovering philosophically. Okay? So it seems for Aristotle, religion can go two ways, right? It can be co-opted into these legal, political things, right? Or it can be a way of I think what he's saying here is like a kind of intuitive revelation can be out in front of what we can prove scientifically, philosophically, and like kind of guide the inquiry. So he's worried about how the religious interpretation of this stuff can be co-opted, right? But it doesn't have to be either.
And you have, speaking of true knowledge as some sort of sense memory. That is not, the five sort of lower senses. And, we should probably talk about the myth of air, which, the end of Plato's Republic, which he talked about. That is such a fascinating myth. Also kind of, I think, dogmatically taken as allegory by, modern scholars. What do you make of that story? Maybe rehash the story for the audience.
Yeah, so in the Republic, was a virtuous person. He dies in battle for the city. It does all the Greek good stuff, right? And he goes, and then it's all wound up with fairly conventional, Athenian views about the afterlife. So he crosses the river Styx, and all the right gods are there. But then it comes to a point where there's kind of a drawing of lots, for where you're going to go in the next life. Okay, and what's interesting is one of the great rewards of the virtuous is they don't care what lot they get, because they know no matter what, they'll be okay, because they're going to have the excellences that carry them through. They'll have it, right? Okay, so that's interesting. All right, and so everyone gets their assigned position for the next life, and then they return. And interestingly, you mentioned this earlier, they all have to sleep next to the river of forgetfulness before they return. But the only one who doesn't drink is her. Okay, so the virtuous person remembers, right? And now, the virtuous person is indifferent to their lot in temporal life. Okay, why? Because they remember, right? Because they know there's something else. Do you see that? So I know people will make something of it. Is this a recollection of a near-death experience for Plato, or maybe like the Eleusinian mysteries, something? Maybe. Like I'm perfectly open to that, right? I don't really have the classical scholarship to weigh in on that, right? But I do think what we're being told there is there's a kind of confidence, right, in the virtuous person, right, and a kind of in touch with, right, like just put it, an in touch with being, right, with the good that the virtuous person has.
Yes.
Yeah. You know what I mean? So that is to take it allegorically, but it's in a way that would like make a concrete difference in concrete.
Yes. Do you think that Plato? Because I look at the Eleusinian mysteries, and I know, it's probably hard to say historically whether these, what exactly happened here. Brian Murarescu.
They were up to something.
They were definitely up to something. You have this place 13 miles northwest of Athens, this, considered the spiritual capital. That, you had Greek leaders and Roman emperors saying this sort of held together society, the fabric of society. And you have these sort of, guardians back then, if you will, Plato, Socrates, Sophocles. Alcibiades was famously in trouble for talking about the mysteries when he was at a festival. Exactly, don't talk about it. And they all undergo these sort of, they drink the Kekion, which is maybe, as speculated by Brian Murarescu, this sort of ergot that contains LSD, this sort of fungal derivative.
What was wine in the ancient world, right? And could it have been spiked with mushrooms or other visionary plants, hallucinogenic herbs, toxins? I think that is a really interesting question. And
that unveils this sort of greater ontological reality, or maybe they experience noesis, kind of primordial knowledge or something. Do you think that was real and informed Plato?
I have no reason to rule that out. Does that make sense? You know what I mean? And like in a lot of ways, it's not like it's not like we discovered, like peyote at Woodstock.
Do you know what
I mean? Like this stuff has been around, right? You know what I mean? I think there's, you know what I mean? So I would be surprised if that wasn't, and we know it's been around in religion and all that, right? Okay. I mean, in like various pagan religions, et cetera.
Sure.
Right? So I'd be surprised if there wasn't something like that going on. Does that make sense?
It does. It's just so funny how we, in the modern age of disenchantment, paint Plato over with this broad brush of like, it's all allegory. He is the father of Western civilization. It's the birth of rationalism. And it's like, well, I don't know. I think the guy was going to Eleusis and drinking some weird shit.
Especially when you read some of the dialogues like Phaedrus and the Symposium. Desire and love are running a lot, right? Okay, and I think that's important to note, right? And I think whatever the mysteries were, right? It does seem like it worked like this, is like you got like a cheat code to the goal line, right? And then you go back and spend the rest of your life trying to think your way back to it. Do you see what I mean?
I do, you immediately like can't fully recollect what you saw with the light. It's almost like, I was actually talking to David Grush about this in my interview with him, and he was like, it's almost like the symbol rate is too slow. Like you literally can't even communicate it in words.
How do you show the light by which we see other things, right?
So you end up, maybe Jesus was one of these people, maybe not, but like prophets famously speak in riddles and allegories and parables, and it's you have to parse their word. I mean, you get the sense, we were talking before the show, Jacques Vallée, was just on Joe Rogan. And, when I speak to Jacques, I get the sense that he knows a lot more than he can even communicate with this stuff.
Yeah.
And he speaks in these sort of riddled, coded parables.
And not just because of like security clearance. Like it's inarticulable.
It's inarticulable. And like, the message will, it's like the people with ears to hear. Like the message will reach the right people. But it's not like this thing where it's like, this happened at this time. You get it now? This is it. That's it. It's like, no, if you knew that, you'd ask more questions. And it's just whatever the truth is like inherently hard to,
I've been reading a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's horror stories lately. Right. Maybe more than I should, but it's interesting. So Lovecraft has this like really pessimistic, dark view of the world.
Yeah.
Okay. But yet, there's always this other thing that's operating. It's inarticulate. You know what I mean? And so it seems like even someone like Lovecraft who has this just dark view of the universe and it's hopeless.
Yeah.
There's still this like Schopenhauerian will operating, but he can't articulate it. Or the characters can't articulate it. Right? It was there. Right? Yeah. And I think, although I don't think Plato has that dark sense, but you still have some of the things Plato. Right? Yeah. And I think a lot of us have this sense that there's another fact.
Yeah, totally. Or like when I was speaking to Diana Pasulka, she said like Christians are not of this world. And it was both this very hopeful statement, where it's like there's other stuff out there, and like maybe the kingdom of heaven is real. But it was this extremely, on the flip side of that, it was almost not nihilistic because you have that other thing there. But it was like this world sucks and it isn't going anywhere super positive, and like at most you can like save yourself and then like hope to tip off the initiation of like a few other people or whatever, and that's it. It's like the idea of saving this world that's tough. And I find it true to me too when I don't know, when somebody has some super virtue signally, like, I'm going to save a world. Think about, like, the 20th century is sort of the age of ideology, utopian sort of, like, visions. And they all ended up in, like, mass death and, like, extremely dysfunctional. So, like, the technocratic solutions don't really work.
So, at a certain point in the Republic, I forget whether it's Glaucon or Adamantus, it says, well, they've just got through, some of the absurdities, like we're going to have to share wives, and we're going to take your kids, and we're raising our kids, and like sex will only happen once a year, like a rigged lottery at spring break kind of thing.
Right.
Okay, all this stuff. And one of the guys says, I don't want to, this is terrible. No one's going to do this. Like this is unworkable, right? And Socrates replies by saying, oh yeah, you're right, but it's the ideal. Okay, and he says, if I painted you a picture of the most beautiful human form, and you said, well, no one looks like that still wouldn't mean it wasn't the most. And I don't think Plato's necessarily saying like the rigged spring break lottery.
1, go! Energy low. Energy critical. Event complete. Gold medal awarded.
Three, two, one, go!
Final lap. Critical. Event complete. Gold medal awarded.
Welcome to basic. 3, 2, 1, go!
Gold medal awarded.
Welcome to Metroid. 3, 2, 1, go!